Welcome back, all dear student friends. We are discussing this very exciting journey of literary criticism, and so far we have talked about right from classicism to romanticism. And by this time, you must have understood that criticism is not just a matter of looking at literature or looking at art, but it is more of a uh, development of a critical bent of your mind, and therefore it's an intellectual work, it's a philosophical work. It adds to the different ideas of looking at literature in particular, and of course looking at life in general, because ultimately literature is a reflection of life. So you are analyzing literature, ultimately means you are analyzing life. So the goal of literary criticism or theory uh, is not just to look at literature, understand literature, analyze literature, try to enhance the pleasure out of it, but it also, at some point of time, definitely reflects on the overall existence of human being. And I think this is the contribution, a greater contribution of all the critics. The essay and the critic who is under our purview or under our discussion for this particular session is a Victorian critic called as Matthew Arnold. And his very famous essay, a work actually called as The Study of Poetry, out of which the some part of it we are going to discuss in this particular session. Uh, what I just told you about the role of criticism and role of critic as a philosopher who gives you some kind of the inner strength, who gives you some kind of the understanding of not just art or not just literature, but life in general. And Arnold is that kind of critic who combines, who looks at literature as a part of life, as it is always, literature or art always comes in the context of life for Arnold. And therefore his contribution in this field must be unique, or it should be regarded as a unique contribution. When you look at Arnold's overall makeup, he was of course a Victorian poet and a critic. Victorian period came up after 1850. So you have a 50 years period between 1798 to almost around 1850, which is considered as a romantic period. And from romantic period up to modern period, this brief interval of hardly 50 years, which is considered as a, a Victorian period. And one of the major writers of this particular time is this man called as Arnold. Of course, Tennyson was there, Browning was there, Hardy was there, but Arnold's contribution in both poetry as well as in criticism, and of course he has written some essays also, is phenomenal in a sense that he definitely has uh, understood the pulse of time, what exactly the people of that time, readers of that time, generations of that time wanted. That's what probably he must have understood very minutely. It is a transition. The entire Victorian period was a transition from the traditional time up to the modern time. Most of the critics and most of the philosophers looked at Victorian period as an interval before modernism. So some part of traditional ideas and some uh, hints of modernity one can find in, or one can found in uh, Victorian time. Lot of struggles, lot of what you called as issues. Victorian time was so much of contradictory forces, where the traditional structures were crumbling down and some new structures were yet to take the place of it. So this is in that sense a very transitional period. And this man was writing during this period. If you remember one of his very great poem called as the Dover Beach, and in that poem, this man suggests the spirit of that particular time. Hmm? The uh, entire poem talks about struggles. Entire poem talks about the problem of adjustments and compromises. And Victorian time, therefore, was a very a turbulent one, a very happening one, in a sense that so many changes were taking place in the ethics at the level of philosophy, at the level of existence, at the level of traditions, at the level of total overall social structures. And therefore, you would find that the Victorian time, there were a lot of questions and queries in the minds of the people. So, on one hand, science was making great progression. On one hand, people like Darwin were challenging the traditional beliefs. On one hand, people like Marx were coming up with different ideas. People like the Newton and Einstein's, of course, Einstein came at a later stage. But then, of course, people like Newton, they 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 were coming up with a very scientifically proved kind of knowledge. And on that part, the traditional beliefs, traditional value systems, traditional ways of thinking, ways of perception were in a way challenged. So Victorian time, in that sense, as I told you, was a very turbulent time. So on one hand, many of the traditional things were challenged and they were probably toppling down, crumbling down. And at the same time, the modernity was taking the shape. It wasn't completely in formation, or it didn't completely came into existence, but it was in formation. The 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 tides of modernity has have already started striking the shores of Victorian time. And therefore you have a very in a way a very unique combination as far as this entire period is concerned. And this man, Arnold, as I told you earlier, probably picked up that pulse, picked up the sense of the time very well. And therefore the entire revision, hmm, this essay, the study of poetry, it is a book. Actually, it's a collection. Some part of the first part we are reading. This book basically talks about, of course, it's a criticism text, though the title is study of poetry, but obviously poetry means literature. So study of poetry in the Victorian context. The book came in 1880, which was, of course, a very high period of Victorian time. Already the modernity was started. But during this time, when this kind of transition was there, how literature should be read, how literature should be understood, and what is the entire role of literary criticism and theory in this kind of transition? What exactly role they are playing? Because many philosophers, especially those who were inspired by the scientific knowledge, they pronounced that uh, now the science is only the thing that we should care for, science or sciences. But there is hardly any scope given to things like literature, things like art, or things like traditional knowledge by these people. So for them, aestheticism, art, literature, reading, all these things were almost outdated. They were the things of the past. So for them, there was hardly any meaning as far as this entire activity of reading literature and analyzing literature and trying to get pleasure out of it. On this background, Arnold came up, and Arnold pronounced that poetry in the fag end of 20th century, that is during the Victorian period, also has got a lot of potential, also has got a lot of uh, influence, and also has got of a lot of importance, even if things are changing. So he was the first man who talked about the high destiny of poetry. High destiny of poetry means the future, bright future for poetry, for literature. Then other people were questioning poetry. When other people were creating a lot of doubts about literature and its utility, this man stood very strong and forcefully told the people, the readers, that poetry has got a bright future. Though there are some transitions and changes are about to happen. But in spite of that, poetry definitely has a bright future, because ultimately we have to turn to poetry to interpret life for us. That was a very significant point. that if you want to understand life, interpret life means what? Understanding life, trying to get the sense of life. So if you want to understand life, you have to get back to the literature and art and poetry, because it is the only thing. Science has importance, philosophy has importance, history has importance, but poetry has a different importance than that. Why? Because poetry has a capacity, he says, to console us and sustain us. These two qualities one can only find in poetry, in literature, that is. One is to console us, it soothes us, it pleases us, it pampers us, it pats us, it sensitively understands the conditions of human beings. So it has a capacity to give you a lot of comfort. Console means what? Who gives you console? Mother gives you console. Elderly people gives you console. So consolation is something that you require when you are in trauma, when you are in some kind of tragedy, when you are suffering some kind of a tragic event. There you require consolation. So in this time when the world was actually moving from uh, sorry, moving from the traditional setup to a totally different setup, the people were totally confused. People were having so many doubts, having so many questions, having a fear also, of course, about the future. And during such time, who would console the people? Who would console the citizens of this world? It was, of course, or it is going to be poetry, according to Arnold. And with poetry, we can sustain. Sustain means we can overcome all the difficulties, either at the level of existence, at the level of philosophy, at the level of mind, at the level of the body, and of course, at the level, more importantly, emotional. So poetry has a capacity to help you to sustain. Sustain means to mm, keep you alive, to support you, not physically but emotionally. Because the ultimately all the kind of chaotic conditions, which I think all of us can understand, because we are facing the same kind of condition because of this Chinese virus, COVID-19. What kind of chaos is outside? Now when that chaos is outside, obviously, what is the worst thing that suffers? It is your emotions. You are emotionally unstable, you are emotionally uprooted, you are always under some sort of threat, you are always under some sort of fear. And there you require some kind of solace, there you require some kind of support. And that support can come through literature, come through criticism, come through poetry. And therefore he says that the science and philosophy has some very limited role in the chaotic conditions, in the kind of transformation, in the kind of the changing conditions of Victorian time. Science